All right. Um, you know what I'm gonna have to do? Give me just a sec here. I think what I'll do is just not, I'll send you all my PowerPoint by email right now, and then you can just kind of follow along with that if you want to, and I'll have my book open on my screen rather than sharing my screen. That'll make it easier for me to track with what I have highlighted. So go ahead and check your email here in a sec, and I'll send you that PowerPoint. Uh, all right, that's sent to you now. So go ahead and open that up. Then you can just kind of follow along there if you want to. And if it's not helpful to you, that's fine too, but you can just have it either way. All right. All right, so then looking at page 82, I'll give you a second, sorry. Does everybody have the PowerPoint that wants it? All right. So then the key idea on page 82, what you hear from Black pulpits is this is a quote then, a carefully crafted selection of words in which the preachers give the impression of spontaneity, pleasing the expectations of a listening congregation that prizes spontaneity as a sign of the movement of the Spirit. Just sit with that for a second there. That's a pretty important idea. What he's saying is that within a certain type of Black church, and he's not saying this is the only type of Black church out there, but within a certain type of church, the goal is to have speech that has been carefully crafted, written in a certain way, but then has the appearance of spontaneity when it comes time. And so this is part of why, I think I said in the instructions for your sermons that I would prefer that you write out a manuscript for your sermon. I'm not saying you have to do this, but that idea of like, often we sort of think in our minds, oh, I'll just tell this story. And it's a story that if we haven't really told it before, we might be surprised when we get to the moment of that the story doesn't sound quite as good as we thought it might. We might just feel like, I thought this was going to be really easy to say, or there's this idea that I think I'll intuitively in the moment be able to explain, but turns out we can't really explain it in the moment. So it's just important, from my perspective, and I do this myself, where I write out everything, and then, but I'm not referring to it as I'm speaking. Like I sort of know where it's going. I have it in front of me in case I want to think about a particular turn of a phrase. So it's not about reading it, but it's more about saying I've thought through how I want to say it because I recognize it's something that has to be said more than it has to be read. Does that make sense? And there's a real difference between writing. You're probably discovering this now, and I even said this to some of you as you wrote your sermons. There's something different that's meant to be spoken as opposed to be written. Something different about hearing something as opposed to reading it. For one thing, and I mentioned this to most of you, but like repetition is not a bad thing in a sermon in the same way it might be in a dissertation or a term paper that you're writing. Because once you've said something, it ought to, in a term paper or an essay, it ought to kind of establish that so that you don't need to kind of re-say it. But it's really different when you're preaching. You need to say things several times often before they're really firmly established in people's minds. So that's the he's saying this is a practice in certain kinds of Black churches, and I think it's a pretty good one for us to kind of take to heart. So that's the first piece. He also notes, let's see, talks about electric amplification as kind of changing things. And we don't often think about how that might change the game. But remember last week we talked about how in certain churches, those particularly with screens, but often also those with really elaborate sound systems, it makes it much more possible for a speaker to be conversational. And we talked about how there's this kind of like confessional, conversational approach that many churches have. That's just not really possible in the same way where you don't have a microphone to make it, to give the illusion of, I'm just talking to you. They're, in a church without that. And so he's saying like, that's also part of the reason why people don't connect with oratory in quite the same way as they used to. It's about the highest compliment that you can pay a preacher. Again, I should probably qualify by saying a white preacher or a preacher in this kind of context, to say like, it felt like he was speaking just to me, right? Like that when someone says that to me, that's often meant as a compliment, because it kind of cut the other people away. But what he's saying is within the Black tradition, and again, we just need to think about this more classically, like classically, the art of oratory is I'm holding a whole room spellbound. I'm speaking to a group of people. There's no illusion of me speaking one-to-one. It's me speaking to a group. And again, I mean, I don't want to draw too many points here, but you can understand how like, if you give the illusion, there's a lot that goes on in modern, again, particularly white evangelicalism, which gives the illusion of it's just me and Jesus, or it's just me and the preacher. And we need to take into account, like, we need to think about the strengths and weaknesses of that, right? We're often talking to people who actually feel very much alone, and feel distant from their neighbors, feel like they don't really know how to relate to other people. So it's important for us to think through the way our worship may be able to challenge that. Like, we want to do more than just kind of like give into that and just yeah. So we want to be able to challenge that in an appropriate way too. So he says when speaking, I just said, when speaking as loudly and clearly as possible, one is less likely to insert hedges like and string phrases together in quick succession without considering their strict logical coherence. So he wants to say like there's just a different approach to the love of language here. Going on, page 84, just talking about how the gift with wording is understood in this tradition as fitness for ministry. And again, I think it would be good for us to think that through, like, again, what in your tradition marks a person as being fit for ministry. Here he's saying like, basically, in this tradition, and I'll just go ahead and read again from page 84, almost all writers who had a firsthand view of this old type of religious leader point out the strange gift for elocution, which seemed on the one hand to draw to him the less fortunate among the slave population, and on the other, to offer the white members of the community an interesting spectacle in the way of religious devotion, or a comic diversion for entertainment of guests. Just the way that this being able to hold a room spellbound pulled in both the kind of highest on the social scale and the lowest on the social scale, and sort of helped a community to sort of cohere around this speaker. And it's always interesting to think about what a culture different than your own sort of says, that's what we think a pastor is. But that gift of wording as being really key for the pastorate is an idea that's important there. He goes from there to talk about the difference between folk preaching and intellectual preaching. And again, this is his distinction. It's not like, this is not like something written in a book somewhere that is, this is the way it is. He's just talking about like, there's two different, within the Black tradition, kind of a folk preaching and an intellectual preaching. And from his perspective, folk preaching is this like, basically an art in its own way. Again, from page 84, characterized by repetition, parallelisms, dramatic use of voice and gesture, a whole range of oratorical devices. The sermon begins with a conversational prose and builds to a rhythmic cadence, regularly marked by exclamations of the congregation, climaxed in a tonal change accompanied by shouting, singing, and ecstatic behavior. And the idea that this sermon kind of emerges from a person as they're speaking, almost. is how this is viewed. He said, in this tradition, they don't really value writing it out. And he quotes Charles Finney here. So this is not just within the Black church. Charles Finney was a white revivalist in the mid 1800s, but he did not like writing sermons. Writing sermons, this is a quote from Finney on page 85, writing sermons had its origin in times of political difficulty. The practice was unknown in the apostles' days. Finney was a very theatrical preacher. And I mean that in every good way. Like he intentionally borrowed from actors and understood the tools that actors had as being able to teach preachers. So he was huge on making eye contact. He said basically the greatest condemnation of Christian preachers is that you can go to a theater, he said, and you're moved by the way in which actors who do not believe the things they're saying make you feel like they believe their things they're saying. They believe the things they're saying. When you go to a church, he said the exact opposite happens. There are people who deeply believe the things they're saying, but they manage to make you think by the way they say it that they don't believe it. And so he was very big on like paying attention to actors and how they, and in fact, when he founded a church of his own, he planted it in a theater for that exact reason, because he thought even the visual cues of having a stage and being able to walk around would prime his audience to be able to encounter him as an actor as opposed to as a preacher. So anyway, he points to Finney as kind of an exemplar of the folk sermon. Then he says the other type within the Black community is the intellectual preacher. And he said their language is filtered through the technology of writing, which is interesting. We don't usually think of writing as a technology, but it is, right? Like it's taking an idea and sort of saying, I'm going to write this down so that it's usable in a variety of different circumstances, as opposed to just living inside me. And what he says is it's kind of the same in some sense, because it's there's designed to be this kind of like a moment of spontaneity, and indeed some spontaneity may be part of it, but there's careful crafting that comes, and then declaiming it from memory in the pulpit. And again, he lists some folks: Gardner Taylor, Manuel Scott, E.K. Bailey, A. Lewis Patterson. I don't know the other folks, but Gardner Taylor, as I mentioned last week, is well worth reading. And again, he talks about how there's kind of a little more of a contrived spontaneity in that tradition. He goes on and gives lots of examples. I don't need us to kind of linger over the examples at all. But towards the end of this, he talks about how in the Black church, this approach to language, there's a sense that language is public treasure. This is on page 93. Unlike mainline traditions where language is regarded as a private domain, the Black church views language as a public treasure. And he says, in a white context, attribution is an essential component. And I talked about this with several of you who included quotes in your sermon. And it's really, I really appreciated the way that he talked about this here. And I tend to be more like him as I think about language. It's important if you're going to, I think it was Brian, if you don't mind me saying so, Brian, like you had told a story at the beginning of your message, and you kind of wanted to allude to where it was from. And so the trick here is like letting people know that you didn't invent it is important, but it's not important to take 1 or 2 minutes of your precious time to tell people exactly where it came from. Like if you're writing a term paper or an essay, you have to cite exactly and tell people exactly where it came from. In a sermon, it's enough to just sort of say, I didn't invent this. Like, yeah, Mary, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just have a question, because I know when we are writing papers and we post it on the internet, it becomes, it has to be, you have to have all the documentation as to where it is.
Yep.
When you're preaching, and if you're doing it and you're recording it on Facebook, wouldn't you have to have some kind of documentation for that as well, though?
Yeah, I would say, again, it depends on what you're posting exactly. So, I mean, if you're just posting a copy of the sermon, I think it's enough to just say, essentially, the story is told, or something to sort of indicate this is not yours. This is.
But you don't need to document it anyway when you're talking. If you're like, if Brian was telling a story, you wouldn't have to do a little bit of documentation and just make sure that you're not plagiarizing in your vocalization of the sermon.
Yeah, so I think the vocalization, I would do that. I mean, again, I think it depends on the particular thing that you post. I mean, if it's customary in your church to have a little blurb with it, I mean, you could certainly indicate where you got something in that blurb. But I think most people are able to track down, you know, for example, if you told a story in the sermon and indicated that it wasn't yours.
Okay, I just know that there's been some pastors that have gotten in trouble because
Yep.
they've given sermons, but they've used other people's information and they never gave them credit. And I'm just, you know, just be nervous about, as we're writing our sermons, to make sure that somehow we document it, because a lot of us are doing it on Facebook or on YouTube, just to make sure we're not guilty of plagiarizing our sermon in our vocalizations.
Yeah, and I guess the key, and again, this is fuzzy here. So I would say, certainly if you're reading a scholar, for example, like if you're citing from a commentary, you could certainly give a nod to the author to say, like, you know, Craig Keener, one of my, you know, for example, Craig Keener says in a commentary that I read, blah, blah, blah. You don't need to say the name of the commentary. It's enough to give that person's name. You know, if you're looking at like an online treasury of sermon illustrations that are anonymous, I don't think you need to say, well, at sermons.com, here's where I got this story. Does that make sense? Like, is there even a sermons.com? I don't know. But, you know, like, you don't need to, I don't think you need to give sources, particularly where there's not a name attached. But again, I feel like it's good practice to say, this is not original with me. There are people who feel free to borrow that without saying that. And maybe, again, maybe I'm guilty as charged when I'm accused of being white in this way. Like maybe there would be a different understanding. I don't know what LaRue would say exactly about that. Because he's saying, like, within this community, it's much more common to sort of borrow and share. I just feel better letting people know I didn't invent this when I come up with something that's really not mine. That said, I mean, I'm at the point personally where I've done this for enough years that if I see what an illustration that I want to use is accomplishing, I can often think of one to use myself that accomplishes the same end. I wouldn't have felt that way when I was first getting started, but with enough practice, I think, you know, you can begin to evaluate, hey, what's really powerful about that story, and how could I sort of adapt that with my own either experience or my own research. So, yeah. Last couple things in this chapter, he just talks about like why language is considered so important in African American communities. Talking about how, you know, Blacks believe that language empowers the marginalized. If you've been to, again, a traditional Black church, part of what is so moving about it is the formality of it. And part of that has the history of saying, this is the one place where we can be, not only be ourselves, but kind of present ourselves directly to God without anybody else kind of intervening and, you know, making us less than. So there's an incredible, again, traditionally, this is not the Black church is not a monolith, but in most Black churches, there's a great deal more formality in dress, style, titles. Like, even, you know, the pastor is not only Reverend so-and-so, but everybody in the church often is either brother or sister so-and-so, carrying that title with them and wanting to be recognized with that title. But language has a lot to do, language has a lot to do with kind of maintaining that formality and saying, here is a place that is of our making, that is beautiful. And I think that, again, we those of us that are from traditions that dial down the formality sometimes lose a little bit of that. Second, use language to render God present. That's from page 95. And that's very strong language, but he's saying basically, like, in other churches, the church has access to and has created often very high art. So he says, you know, like, you know, white traditions have access to Bach and Beethoven on the organ, right? And saying, like, there's this kind of high classical music. There are all sorts of things which create a sense of transcendence. And he's saying in the Black church, that's primarily done with words, which, again, it's important for us, those of us who are from traditions where it's kind of the unchurch and the formalities dialed down, to realize we lose something when we, you know, that words can do that. Words can evoke a sense of the transcendent. And mostly they did not do that in my church growing up, maybe occasionally. But that's a really distinct approach to the language. He uses the language of calling forth language to call forth a world that does not exist. That idea that Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, right? Like it's it's putting words on something which might just exist in my mind that I might be hoping for and longing for. Again, it's related to that idea of transcendence through words. And finally, Black's using language to create an environment for belief. And I thought this sentence from 97 was really good. Whites are more inclined to use language for information, whereas Blacks are more inclined to use it for inspiration. And maybe that's part of why some of the question about citation in the sermon, right? Like, because when I feel like I should share a citation is when I'm sharing a new piece of information. And what he's saying is it just carries a different function in my community. It's there to inspire, and so we naturally want to share it rather than being worried about sort of who gets credit for it. So you can see the questions that I have listed there just for some discussion for thought. Like, what preacher have you heard, if any, who you would say had a very artful approach to language? And how did their sermons make you feel? Like, can you picture a sermon or a preacher or a sermon that was very artful, where language really accomplished what he's saying this is designed to accomplish in our communities?
I don't know if I can remember a specific preacher, but I do enjoy when someone is willing to take the verbiage of how they explain something in a way you wouldn't normally, hear. Like even describing a chair or a bench, or in a way that you kind of look at it differently, or you look at a river differently, or just kind of describing that. And it all goes back to the imagination thing that we talked about. You're painting this picture through words, but you're changing the words from what you normally speak in everyday life, but using them to be able to spark more interest in what you're saying.
I think that's really good. Often what that communicate, if you think back to my little 3 axes kind of thing at the beginning, like understanding yourself, understanding the text, understanding your audience, often that ability to like look at a chair or a river differently, that's a really good skill for you to have for lots of reasons. But one is that it tells people, oh, he's looking at me with the same care, right? Like he's able to see the little things in life and see them in a distinct way. And it sort of helps the audience to know, okay, like I can trust this person as they're because they see me, because they have a keen eye. They're not just rushing to make their point. They see things. That's good. Yeah. Others of you, like, have you heard a preacher who had a very artful approach to language? Nobody else? No artful preaching? I will invite you to listen next week when we have Meredith Griffin coming on to join us. He grew up a Baptist, African-American, grew up a Baptist, but he's quite an artful preacher. So I'll be curious to see your reaction to him. When you look at the folk versus intellectual preaching, I just was curious, like, did either one of those jump out to you? Like, I've heard more folk preaching or I've heard more intellectual preaching. Like, how would you characterize most of the preaching that you've heard if you had to give it one or the other? He talks about folk preaching as being this very like spontaneous, putting a lot of emphasis on someone who can just express in the moment, whereas intellectual preaching is like putting a lot more emphasis on crafting the words just right and then bringing it in the moment. Did you see one or the other? Like, which is more common in your background?
I think our church definitely has an intellectual style preaching that you can tell, like our teaching team, like they perfect certain words. They're looking for words. They're intentionally placing those words in places. So yeah, definitely that. I'm not sure about the folk preaching though. I'm not sure, like, and maybe it's because I'm so like chapel immersed. I try to branch outside that, but everything seems so planned
Mhm.
that it's hard. It makes you long for that folk preaching, though. It makes you want to see something more spontaneous and I don't want to say more Holy Spirit driven, but just that like not putting the Holy Spirit so crunched in that box where it's so perfectly timed, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah. It's interesting how these two things work hand in hand. When I started in my role, I felt like a traditionalist in some ways, right? Like with some of my students going to more churches like the chapel, and I felt like, having grown up in Little First Baptist and then being a Wesleyan pastor, I felt like more traditional. And sometimes there was that illusion of it being very spirit controlled. But then when students would run chapel, they often would have these sheets, and I don't know if they have them at the chapel, Jeanette, but it's like 11:35, like put on the countdown timer, 11:39 lights up, 11:40, announcements start, 11:41 and 15 seconds, announcements end. And then, and I was like, wow, this is like super planned out. So yeah, I think, and odds are, if you're immersed in that world, it looks a little lazy if it's not done that. If we go in unprepared, people begin to sense, oh, things not done so well this week. And you're right. I mean, I think folk preaching is very different. And it puts more emphasis on the character of the preacher, again, for good or for ill. But that sense of like a person who's ready to sort of stand and deliver, a person who walks in the world, walks in the scripture in such a way that when the time comes, the words are going to come to them. And it's a very different approach. So, any other thoughts on the folk versus intellectual? Yeah, Joseph.
Well, I can say, like, the church I'm currently attending right now, it seems like, I can tell, it seems like the church from start to finish is very structured.
Mhm.
But when the pastor gets up there to give his message, then it seems like it goes more into folk. He can be very spontaneous. You can feel, he knows the scripture, and he feel like he's talking to the people,
Mhm.
but it's not like he's crafted that language either.
Mhm.
But you can tell, but at the beginning of the sermon, all the way from the beginning of church start to the time he starts, it's like, yeah, he's probably going to say these words, and it's probably going to be the same repetition, and then he'll give his sermon, which is like, you can tell he's got the folk, the fire.
Yep.
Then once the sermon's done, then we're back to getting ready to close out the service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So often there's again, even if he's prepared something a certain way, there's a sense which it might go a little bit of a different direction while it's up there. And while he's up there, I mean, but I appreciate you also saying like there might be kind of catchphrases or ideas that a folk preacher regularly comes back to. And that's part of the strength and weakness of it, right? Like, eventually you begin to sort of catch on to a person's particular, I mean, because again, naturally speaking, if we're not including the Holy Spirit, all of us just sort of return to certain patterns, certain ways of speaking, etc. And so that's the real, that's the real danger of the folk tradition, is that it can become sort of repetitive without seeming to be.
But I don't know, but in doing that though, it seems like it's like you're ready for that sermon. You're ready to see, hey, let's go from the all planned out. Let's get to that spontaneous part. You're ready to hear that pastor give his message.
Yep. And I think, again, I mean, I don't want to tell you what kind of preachers you should all become. I mean, I do think being ready in a moment to shift is a pretty important thing. I mean, I'll give you one little example from I recently did a sermon where I was talking about the ending of the book of Mark, like it was on the resurrection. And I was making the point, like, most people think the book of Mark ends after the 8th verse, which just the women were, they ran from the tomb terrified because they were afraid. And I was saying, like, basically I was trying to make the point, like, this is I like the book of Mark a lot because it's very real about what the people are feeling. And I said, Mark's probably the first gospel to be written. And so because of that, the later gospels give us a little more to kind of not soften the story, but kind of fill in some of the details. But Mark is just like They went away, they were terrified, and that's probably how the book ends. And somewhere as I was preaching it, just came back into my mind like something I had heard years ago when I was studying it, about how some people think the book of Mark ends like it does because we're supposed to write the ending, right? Like the ending is kind of up to us. What we do with that sense of fear and terror, and whether we choose to recognize Christ is risen and it's good news, or whether we run and stay afraid forever, which may or may not be true, right? I mean, that's like one scholar's perception of it. So that kind of popped into my mind as I was preaching. I was like, oh, I got to build the conclusion around this. And so I kind of did on the fly. I mean, it might not have been quite as tight as it would have been if I had sort of thought of that as I was writing, but I was glad I was flexible enough in that moment to like make a little pivot. I would not be comfortable being a folk preacher and just like jumping up there and being like, God's Spirit's going to give me everything I need for this moment. Like, that's just not exactly who I am. But I was glad, and I think we do have to have that sensitivity to our audience to sort of say, right now I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to shift away from this thing that I've taken such care with. So yeah, good. Just thinking a bit about chapter 8. We'll just take a quick run through here. Won't take long on it, but part of what I like about this is, again, it kind of gets at, if you remember when we were talking about the 4 pages of the sermon, and I was saying, like, for Wilson, it's very important to start with the text. And I really liked how he basically, LaRue basically says, it's okay to start with the text. It's okay to start with your people. It's okay to start with what scholars say. And, you're doing some reading and an idea comes to you. So just to realize that there are lots of different ways to approach this, and that none of them has to be more biblical than another. Different people, some people are going to be inspired to write sermons when they're reading the scripture and an idea jumps out to them. And some are going to be inspired to write sermons when a particular need or in their congregation jumps out to them. Some people are going to be inspired when they see something beautiful. And most of us are going to be an amalgamation of all those things, right? Like, we're just in different days, we're going to be different people on different days. I talked about how some people write sermons slowly and some sprint. I realize now in looking at my PowerPoint that I put the wrong "write" in there. That's not impressive. Some people WRITE should say, and some sprint. I did put there, just so you're aware, my practice for writing is that I actually write sermons very quickly. Usually for me, a sermon comes out of me in about 2 to 3 hours. But I try to spend that 2 or 3 hours well in advance of the time I have to preach it. If you remember something LaRue talked about when he was thinking about imagination the previous week, he talked about how you should practice imagination both before and after the sermon is written. And so for me, having a draft done on 5 days before I have to preach, usually, that gives me enough time to sort of be more passive about it and let new ideas come in that I might try to then synthesize into the sermon. Does that make sense? I find if I write a sermon Saturday night, like some people do, the sermon doesn't have time to sit, percolate, and for new ideas to come out for me. And again, you don't have to do it my way, but I would say, like, at least I would really commend to you what LaRue has said. Oftentimes the imaginative process doesn't end after we draft something. And so for me, like, I even know sometimes when I'm writing a sermon, and usually my sermons are about 4 pages single spaced or so. And I know that when I get done with the draft, sometimes I'm not real happy with it, but I'm like, it's got time. Like, it's got 5 or 6 days and something will come to me to sort of help bump this along. But it helps to have it drafted. Again, you don't need to do it my way, but I found that to be a really good practice for me. Yeah, last thing, and I see Lenny's on, so we'll let him in just a minute, but actually, let me just send him a quick message. Yeah, 4 good questions to ask of a sermon. I appreciated LaRue putting this in here. So first, are the scriptures taking the lead in the shape and development of the sermon? I think that's a really great way to put it. Remember, we said, like, some people will be, the Bible will explicitly inspire this idea. And while I don't need it to start for you at the Bible, I do need the scriptures to be leading the sermon rather than vice versa. So if you get the great idea because of a need that you sense in your congregation or because you saw a beautiful sunset, that's great. But make sure that the scriptures are taking the wheel in the sermon. Does that make sense? Is there a clearly defined controlling thought for the sermon? Like, is it clear what the sermon is trying to accomplish in a couple of sentences? Is the sermon lucid and clear enough to be followed with the listening ear? And what does the sermon cause the listener to want to do? Again, I wasn't thinking of this when I was thinking of your sermons, but these are good things to take a look at in light of your own drafts that you have for now. You know, how does this sound? What am I hoping that people will take away? And is it reasonable that people would, as I read over my draft, you know, is it reasonable to think that someone would hear these things and that they would take away the thing I'm hoping they would take away? So we'll leave LaRue there for now. I want to let Lenny in. So if you have any questions, just jot them down. We'll jump back after break and think a little more about this. But let me go ahead and bring Lenny in. Hey, Lenny. How are you?
Hello, Mike and class.
There you are. Good to see you.
Good to see you.
Yeah. So I told folks before you came on, but I'm not sure if I got your title right. You are Professor of Proclamation in Christian Ministry. Is that correct? Is that the right
That
title?
works. Yes.
At Wesley Seminary, which is at Indiana Wesleyan in Marion, Indiana. And I also mentioned that we had I had the good fortune of knowing you. You were well, I remember you as being a senior in my Jeremiah class. I think it was Jeremiah, where you were a senior and I was a freshman, and I was overwhelmed in the Jeremiah class by Carl Schultz and his knowledge of Jeremiah, which was deeper than I thought was a thing. Like, I didn't know someone could know Jeremiah that well. And then I think you stayed
Well,
on.
he grew up with Jeremiah.
I think he did. That's right. That's right. And then I think you were on staff with the Houghton Church afterward, right? Did you do that?
I was youth pastor for about a year. Then Wes Oden realized how much I hated kids and wisely made me college pastor.
Okay. Yeah, you know, Lenny, I was thinking about a sermon I remember you preaching, and I don't know if you'll remember this or not, but I was thinking about it the other day. You were talking about one of your illustrations was like when you're driving down the road and someone flashes their high beams at you to tell you that there's a cop around the bend and you should probably slow down. And I remember when you said it, like I was totally tracking. So Lenny and I are from like the same part of the world, and I was like completely tracking. And but I something like caught you up in that moment where I think you were nervous that you were admitting that you were speeding in front of people. And so then you said something like, "Not that I speed. I mean, maybe I do." Like anyway, I was just like, "Oh man, I feel so bad for Lenny right now."
It's not me. It's my heavy foot.
That's right.
Not me.
Whatever it was, you managed to like homiletically extract yourself from that situation, which was very impressive. But anyway, just was remembering a very early Lucetti sermon. But anyway, we're glad to have you here, Lenny. As I mentioned to Lenny, and the class knows this, you're the next book that we're reading. We're going to read your Preaching with Empathy. And so I imagine you'll tell us a little bit about that tonight. I did also forward along to them a link for the session you're doing next week. And if you want to tell them anything about that, that's fine. I mean, I shared with them what there is, but if there's anything specific, they should know that. So.
Yeah, would love to have you. It's going to be super practical, and there'll be time for Q&A in that session. It's about an hour-long webinar, and 10 small tweaks for big preaching impact. So it's really a culmination of some little tweaks that I've learned over the 25 or so years that I've been preaching, and I still haven't figured it out. People will sometimes, because I wrote a couple books, introduce me as a preaching expert. And to me, that's as oxymoronic as parenting expert. There is no such thing, right? Because just like parenting, preaching is impossible to get your hands around. And just when you think you figure it out, the culture changes and you change. And so your congregation changes. So that's what I think attracts me to preaching so much, is that it's a beautiful mystery, just like the God we proclaim. So yeah, thanks, Dr. Jordan. MJ, I want to call him MJ because anytime I get a chance to call somebody MJ, I do.
That's good, yeah.
I can tell people I know MJ. Magic Johnson, Michael Jordan, Michael Jackson. All those MJs. So yeah, thank you for the chance to come and be with your class. I know you don't just let anybody in on your sheep as you shepherd them through this course. So thanks. I take that seriously. And thank you for being up this late at night and willing to listen to a stranger. I do know Mary. I think I know Mary, right? I think from Penn, was it Penn Jersey or Western New York District? I can't remember where. Okay, yeah. So good to see you, Mary. I want to scratch where you itch. Sorry for the image. And so what I'll do is I'll present my 5-minute rationale for why preaching with empathy matters. And then I'll share for maybe 5 to 7 minutes on my sermon preparation process. Is that okay? And then you can ask me anything you want about preaching.
Sounds good.
And we'll just have some open Q&A if that's all right. So let me share my screen.
Did I give you the power to do that? Sorry, maybe I didn't give you the
Yeah.
power to do it.
Not yet.
Go ahead and try it now.
Okay, that
That's
works. Okay, do you see my PowerPoint? Okay. Let me just widen out my screen so I can see you all. Okay. Yeah, so in my estimation, the best preachers are not the best talkers, but actually the best listeners. The sermon preparation process really, I think, is a process of empathically listening to God, which is, devotional, empathically listening to the text that we preach, which is exegetical, and empathically listening to the congregation, which is contextual. So good preaching is listening empathically to God, to the text, and to the people to whom we preach. Good preaching is not just about getting God right, as if we could. It's not about just getting the text right or getting the rhetoric right. Good preaching really is about also getting the people right, the particular people to whom we preach. And as I journey through my education and my preaching, there were a lot of books written on the theology of preaching in terms of trying to rightly portray God and proclaim God, doing exegetical work in the text. There were a lot of books about rhetorical style and form and delivery. At least when I was coming through my education, there was very little that I discovered was written about preaching in a way that empathized with the hopes and hurts of the people to whom I preached. So that when I preached, I wasn't just a bold prophet who represented the will and the way of God to people. I was also an empathic priest who, with my words, represented the hopes and hurts of my people to God. And so a sermon should be bringing the two of those things together. It should be faithful to God and fitting to the people to whom I preach. Or another way of putting it is, it should be theologically substantive and contextually relevant. That's what makes a good sermon good, I think. So a good example of this sort of empathic preaching is Dennis Kinlaw. I don't know if you ever heard him preach, but when I was a college pastor at Houghton, at the Houghton Wesleyan Church, one of my jobs was to work with the, what do we call it? The spiritual life emphasis. Was that what it was called?
Clue, Christian
Clue,
life emphasis.
Christian life emphasis.
Yeah.
And I would work with the speaker, go pick this, which meant I would do everything Wes Oden didn't want to do. I would go pick up the speaker from the airport. And the Clue speaker would come and speak to college students, 18 to 22-year-olds, for a week-long revival services, basically. When I picked up, I didn't know who Kinlaw was. When I saw him at the airport, I thought, man, this guy is going to bomb. He's in his 70s, coming to speak to young adults. He's an Old Testament brilliant scholar coming to speak to collegiates, half of whom don't even know the book of Zephaniah is in the Bible. They're worlds apart. There's no way he's going to speak to them in a way that's going to connect with them. But I would say in my 7 years at Houghton, seeing many speakers come and go, that Kinlaw probably had the most profound impact. And I sort of ask myself now, why was he able to, how did he bridge the generational gap, the geographical gap? He's a Southern boy coming to Houghton, New York. the educational gap. How did he bridge those gaps of distance between himself and his listeners? And I would say it was empathy. People not only got the sense that Kinlaw walked with God, these 20-year-olds also sensed that he knew them as well. Let me just define empathy, and you'll get into this in the book when you read it, I hope. Empathy is the capacity to imagine ourselves into another person's situational shoes so that we think what they think and feel what they feel. Another way of thinking about it is empathy is the skill. It's not only the skill, but it's also the disposition, the hospitable disposition that bridges the gap of difference and distance between myself, my experience, and my listener's experience. So, of course, Jesus is the epitome of empathy. I mean, God wanted to empathize with the human race. So he literally jumped into human flesh, blood, and bone to become one of us and one with us. But Jesus, not only in the incarnation, epitomizes empathy, but even the way he preached was empathic. To rural Jews, he preached about the kingdom of God being like a farmer who went out to sow seed. So he was always trying to make connection with peasant agrarian Jews. Jesus was faithful to the Father, but he was also fitting to the context, substance and relevance. So let me just leave it there. It's just sort of so the reason why I wrote the book was just to validate the importance, highlight the importance of preaching in a way that was insightfully connected to the people to whom we preach. And I think as pastors, right now I'm a guest speaker. I pop into a camp and preach, or guest speaker at a church, and I don't really know anybody. If you're in a pastoral setting, you have the privilege of journeying with the same group of people through the ups and downs of life. And when you preach, your words evidence your empathic awareness of them. Your words are sheep-scented, not just faithful to God, but fitting to the people to whom you preach. Does that make sense? I don't want to put other preachers down, but you walk into a church and to maybe a small, mid-sized church or a large church, and man, the people are in love with the preaching, and you listen to the sermon and you think, it's mediocre at best. You don't say that, hopefully, but you think it. And it's because that preacher has precisely put to words the gospel, articulated for the people to whom he or she preaches, what they feel deep in their soul, but can't articulate for themselves. And when a preacher puts to words what we feel deep in our soul, it's awesome preaching, even if to an outsider it seems mediocre. All right.
Hey, Lenny, can I just, before you jump over, I want to tell you, to affirm you, the Dennis Kinlaw, I remember the sermon well. Like, I remember one of his sermons, particularly, he preached on Paul and Ananias, and his tagline of, if it could happen on a street called Straight, it could happen at a college called Houghton. So I remember it distinctly. So
I remember
that point. It was memorable. Yep. It
was memorable. He didn't wear baggy pants or sport a goatee and tattoos, but he was memorable, and he connected. Let me shift and talk about my sermon preparation process, and then we'll just have some open Q&A. I think of the preacher as Theotokos. Theotokos means literally God, Theo, bearer, Tokos. It was a word actually that the early church at the Council of Ephesus gave to Mary. It was them trying to say that when Mary gave birth to Jesus, she didn't just birth a good man, she birthed God. Out of her came God. And in a similar way, not the same way, but in a similar way, I think of the preacher as Theotokos. That is, our call is not just to preach a good sermon as if that wasn't hard enough. Our calling is to, through our words, birth a sermon that makes Christ incarnate so that people encounter him in the moment the words are preached. That's a pretty tall order, I realize. But so I think of preaching as a process of birthing. I've never given birth to a baby. I've watched my wife give birth to 3. So when I talk about preaching as a birthing process, she wants to slap me. But I think of preaching as a process of birthing, because unless we're downloading from pastors.com somebody else's sermon, the sermon has our DNA all over it, right? We've wrestled with the angel of the text and come away with Jacob limping under the weight of a word for the Lord. It's dripping with our DNA, our wrestling. And if I want for my preaching, I want for my students' preaching to be said of what was said of Mary. That is, what is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. So I want to talk about a process for birthing sermons that I think has the potential to conceive, to have spirit-conceived sermons, okay, to birth spirit-conceived sermons. So I start with conception, divinity. Obviously, we have to have something of substance to say, and what I mean by that is, this is the time when I would empathically, it would be me, my Bible, Holy Spirit, my people in my heart and mind, my pen or my laptop paper, and I would spend 4 to 6 hours on Monday morning just trying to listen to the heart of God through this biblical text I was preaching or topic, and trying to, at the same time as I'm doing exegesis of the text, asking questions of the text that I think my people would want me to ask on their behalf. So I think it's a fallacy to think that we can totally separate our pastoral context from exegetical study. You got to separate them because you don't want to skew the text. I think actually we should bring our congregation with us in our hearts and heads while we exegete a biblical text, so that through our words, then we can bring the two together. So that's about a 4 to 6 hour process early Monday morning for me when I was pastoring. And then on Tuesday morning, after I've had some time for the text to marinate overnight, ultrasound is me putting the sermon in a sentence, coming up with a declarative word from the Lord for this coming Sunday. What will the sermon say? How can I put this in a sentence that is substantive and faithful to God, but also contextually relevant to my people? That would often be, again, about an hour-long process. After I had some clarity, ultrasound, I knew if I was having a girl or a boy, or how big the baby was. Then there was the water break, which is the creativity part, which is the fun part for me. This is brainstorming creative metaphors, images, illustrations, mantras, stories. And that would be Tuesday morning. After I got some clarity, it would be Tuesday morning, 2 to 3 hours. And then usually on a Wednesday morning for 2 to 4 hours will be the labor. And this is laborious. This to me is the most laborious part of the sermon preparation process. It's when I have to decide on how this sermon will flow in terms of outline, structure, what the design will be. Will it be a point-based sermon? Point 1, exposition, illustration, application. Point 2, exposition, illustration, application. Point 3. Or will it be a plot-based sermon? Setting, problem, climax, resolution. And there's a whole lot of variety between those two. That's hard. That's hard work because it's taking all the notes and now putting it into a structure, not for the sake of my recall, but for the sake of listener experience through the journey of the sermon. And I stopped about halfway through my preaching ministry. I stopped thinking of the sermon as sort of 4,000 words I have to come up with, and started to think of it as 7 to 10 stones, moves that I had to step on to cross the sermonic stream. And if I can get those 7 stones I had to cross in order, I could internalize the sermon well. I would also manuscript. Once I had the outline, I would word it out, manuscript it. And then there's the delivery. And everything can be great up to delivery, and you can botch delivery, right? You can have this content dripping with substance and then mess it all up with a poorly delivered sermon. So, good content with poor delivery diminishes the content. It's just the reality, because preaching is not a written event. It's an oral event, which makes me wonder why so many of us will spend 10 to 15 hours writing the sermon and maybe an hour or less preparing to deliver it. Preaching is oral, not written. Which is why I do this, and I encourage my students to apply the 25% rule. The 25% rule is this: if allocate 25% of your overall sermon preparation time to praying through, practicing, internalizing, memorizing the content, so that when you stand to deliver, you can empathically connect with people, not be enamored with your paper. So I spend about 4 hours getting the sermon in me so I can stand up and look at people when I preach to them. And it's amazing what the brain does. There's mirror neurons in the brain that give us the capacity to feel what people feel and think what they feel in the moment they feel and think it. So if you're into your paper, you're going to miss that. But if you're looking at people while you're preaching to them, you're adjusting what you're saying and how you're saying it based on the cues they're giving you without even realizing you're doing it, if you're in the moment. So I would do 2 hours on Saturday, get the sermon in me, 2 hours on Sunday morning. So that's basically my process. Any questions, pushback?
So I'll throw it open to everybody if you have questions on it, but I'll just say to start us, Lenny, I appreciate, we had just talked about the option of manuscripting. And I said, I really recommend manuscripting just because we sometimes think we know how we're going to tell a story. We just say, I'll tell this story, but we haven't really thought the words through, and it's really helpful. But I didn't give any guidance about sort of practicing and internalizing it. But I think that way of doing it is really good, to think through, your availability to people. If you have the paper, the stuff on the paper kind of living inside you, and then you really do, the whole audience, the whole congregation is giving you feedback that you can receive if you can look up and receive it. So it's a really good way of thinking about it.
Absolutely. But I commend the use of a manuscript too, or not the use of it maybe when you go up to preach, but the writing of a manuscript. Because if not, we get real lazy and redundant with our language. At least I do. Yep. And sometimes as important as the bricks is the mortar between the bricks. That is, not only are the main moves of the sermon important, but so are the transitions, the mortar, to get to the next one. And so manuscripting helps with that, I think.
Yeah, it's good. So questions from you. I mean, I could ask Lenny questions all day, but what have you heard that you have questions about, thoughts on? He even invited pushback if you have that. So
I'm from Philadelphia, man, Rocky Balboa territory. So we might end up fighting.
I really like the fact that you throw all your ideas like into a big bucket, and then you construct them together. You take, and that's kind of how I've been doing the sermon we're doing for this class, is all through a couple weeks. So I keep pumping these little ideas that kind of add to my sermon and different things. But when I sit down, now you have to figure out where you're going to be able to put that in your story or in your sermon and how it's going to fit. And I really like how you talked about really having the empathy and understanding who your congregants are. So you might take that story you've been thinking about and be able to change that to really focus in on people and what they're feeling, knowing what your people are going through or stuff like that. And that's kind of neat. But my challenge, I think, is trying to get them chunks of information in the right order to be able to deliver them at the right time, I guess.
Yeah, that's, to me, thanks, Brian. Good thoughts. To me, the hardest thing to learn in preaching is that labor part, in terms of putting a sermon together, how to structure, because you have so much material. By the time you get to that labor, or that fourth step, you've got all kinds of images and illustrations and exegetical gems. That's why the second stage is so important for me, is getting clarity. Because once I know what this particular, you can't say everything Sunday. You just can't, you'll blow people away. They won't hear anything. Less is more. So if you can scale down into one substantive, relevant word of the Lord, the sermon, then you know what to leave on the cutting room floor. And you just have to have the discipline to do it.
And that's exactly what even Mike commented about, is sometimes I'm trying to say the same thing a couple different ways. When just say it once, and you'll be done. Say it the best way once.
It's good. Thanks, Brian.
And I was just curious, so when you're going and you're being a guest preacher, and you're trying to work in your empathy but you know, you're a guest preacher. You don't know really anything about these people, about their background, or do you do your research? Do you have like a long discussion with the current pastor before you even get there, so you can kind of figure out how you're going to target or how you're going to incorporate your empathy within your sermon?
Yeah, great question, Joseph. Yeah, I do. I have a conversation, usually almost always have a conversation with the host who invited me to speak to their group. And I have a written form called a ministry request form that I send out, and they just tell me a bit about their context. I ask questions like, in 5 words, describe the group, which is hard because most groups are rather diverse, but as a whole, how would you describe them? And, you know, what are their needs, that kind of thing. And then I think, again, just if I'm really prepared, prayed up and prepared, in the moment while I'm preaching, I can gather a lot of information intuitively just by looking at people to whom I preach. And I see everything. I'm one of those people. I see everything. I wish I didn't, but I do. Some people, when they preach, it's just a blur. But I see everything. I remember when I was at my first church, I was a Houghton College senior. I was pastoring a church on a dirt road, 15 miles away, farm flies everywhere. And a bunch of my college buddies came, and their goal was to get me to laugh during the sermon. So I actually developed the discipline of seeing all kinds of, my friends would eat farm flies while I was preaching, they'd write nasty stuff in my notes. So it really helped me stay in tune while I was watching them. But to get to your question, I mean, I think we have this capacity in us, a grace really, to empathize with people just simply by observing them, trying to feel what they feel. And then I hope intuitively I'm adjusting what I'm saying and how I'm saying it. Sometimes it means cutting my sermon short, and I've done that. I'm like, man, I'm losing them. This is a bad time. Sometimes it means going longer, taking my time. Maybe it's pausing and praying or giving them space to reflect. It's just being in the moment.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Anybody else? Lenny, one question I would have for you about empathy, particularly, we are both from kind of an evangelical tradition that sort of values, sometimes they'd say like hard-hitting sermons, like that's sometimes a compliment we pay to a sermon, is like it hurt, but in a good way. And sometimes empathy really pushes against that. Like, do you find people who are like preachers who are skeptical of empathy because they think like, if you're too empathetic, you're not going to tell people what they need to hear? Like, if that's the case, like how do you resolve that? Like, how do you think empathy serves truth telling rather than hinders it?
Yeah, I'll say it like this. One of my favorite verses to guide my preaching, at least I hope it does, is John 1:14. It says, Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. And some preaching is all bold, prophetic, truth. We see ourselves as truth tellers. And the problem with just seeing ourselves as truth tellers and not grace givers is that we come across as abrasive and people don't hear the truth. When actually with a spoonful of empathic sugar, the medicine goes down, right? So like if people sense empathic grace from you, that you get them and know them and love them and struggle with them and want to represent them to the Father, they are more likely to listen to your bold prophetic truth when you share it. I mean, Jesus could slap people in the face and they felt hugged because he loved them so well. And I think the same is true with preaching.
That's a good insight. I think, if you presume that your listeners want to do the right thing, rather than sort of giving off verbal cues all the time that you don't trust them to want to do the right thing, and you think, it's no wonder that people would get their defenses up listening to that.
Yeah, like it's almost like I've walked out of, I confess, I've walked out of a church or two when I felt like the preacher was just coming at me, that he or she was the only one in the room who knew anything about God. And or they just were so into the good news, playing that one string on their violin, everything comes up roses all the time if you just love God, that I discredited them and viewed them as just living in la la land. That's not my world. Because sometimes faithful people hurt. Sometimes life stinks. sometimes God doesn't show up how or when we thought he would. And so if you don't speak the truth of my situation, like I say to my students, if you're not honest about the bad news I know,
Mhm.
I'm not going to listen to you about the good news I hope for when you get to it in the sermon, right? So speak bad news that I know, and then bring me to the good news I hope for.
Mhm. Last question I want to make sure I ask you is just about your preparation process. Do you think of yourself, like one of the things we've been weighing is, do you have to start with a text, or can you kind of start with a perceived need or an inspiration that comes for a sermon that comes from outside the text? I'm wondering how you look at that question. Like, are you the type who thinks I need to always start with the biblical text and a good sermon always grows out of that? Or do you think like the idea for a sermon could come out of anywhere? I'm just curious how you approach that, Lenny.
Yeah, I don't know that we ever come to any text a clean slate, really, anyway, even if we're pure textual preachers. When I was pastoring, I did mostly textual preaching, where I said, I'm going to preach from the Gospel of John these 4 weeks, and tried it best I could to let the text determine the topic. But there were other times when I did topical series where the topic determined the texts.
Mhm.
And there were a few times where I went into a text thinking it was going to relate to a topic and discovered in my study of the text that it didn't.
Mhm.
And I had a choice to make. Was I going to let the topical tail wag the dog or go with the text? And those were tough times.
Mhm.
I think even if we take seriously the liturgical calendar,
Mhm.
Advent and Lent. I mean, we have 4 weeks of Advent, 6 weeks of Lent. So in a sense, the texts are determined for us if we go with those
Mhm.
liturgical high points.
Yeah.
I'm preaching on Pentecost in a couple weeks here at College Church, and they sort of, I'm going to Acts 2, and really the whole book of Acts. So I'm going to try to do a whole book of Acts in 20 minutes. See if I can do that.
Great. That sounds challenging. I tell people preach one sermon at a time, Lenny. So if you need me chirping in your ear, give me a call if you start preaching too many sermons at once.
Okay.
I'll talk you off the ledge. But
You got it.
all right, Lenny, this has been great. Thank you so much for your time tonight. I really appreciate it. And we're looking forward to reading your book, and I'll send you along any feedback we have along the way. I really appreciate the topic, and I've appreciated my read through it, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with others.
Thanks so much, Mike. Appreciate it. Thanks, class. Thanks for having me.
All right. See you, Lenny.
God bless, guys.
All right. So, let's see. All right. Lenny's out. I'm pondering just pushing through for 15 or 20 more minutes before just ending for the night. Does that sound okay with you rather than breaking? If you need a break, just go do your thing, but we'll push on to the end. I'm going to jump over to Barbara Brown Taylor, though, because we didn't talk about Barbara Brown Taylor last week. I thought that was bad, so we need to talk about her this week. So we'll talk about her chapter on, let's see what number it is. Chapter 5 on the Bible. And actually, before we get into that, any reflections on what Lenny said? Anything jump out to you? I left really interested, his little idea about like being faithful to the text and being faithful to the people sounded very much like what I had told you before. He didn't include that element of like who I am as a preacher, which may just be a distinct, I have thought if we'd had more time with Lenny, I might have asked him like how who he is inflects the sermon that he preaches, because I'm sure he'd agree with the idea that if Lenny preaches something, or if I preach something, or if you preach something, it's going to sound different because of who we are. But it was just interesting that he didn't make that. He talked about 2 of my 3 kind of axes, but he didn't talk about the kind of who he is as a person and how that makes a difference. So, all right, let me go ahead and share this. So, all right. So this is chapter 5 of Barbara Brown Taylor, and this is her section on the Bible. Just to start off, I would just say at the beginning, as an Episcopalian from a more liberal faith tradition than the Wesleyan Church, and I think a more liberal faith tradition than probably anybody represented on this call, how she looks at the Bible might not be exactly how you and I would look at the Bible. Just like I think Cleo LaRue in looking at the Bible is not, we talked about how, his idea, like within the Black church tradition, there's such an emphasis on looking at the Bible as our book and seeing ourselves reflected in the story. And that's not exactly how I grew up thinking of it. And so it's okay. Like, I just want to give you kind of room and space and emotional permission to not totally agree with Barbara Brown Taylor, or to say like her way of doing this is a little different than mine. Hopefully there's something here for you to learn. But I guess I just, I think sometimes when we read a text like this, we think, oh, is she going to say something dangerous about the Bible? Or is there something I disagree with? So you're welcome to think through what you agree with and disagree with. But I think there is something helpful in the way she approaches this that might be good for us. So some of her thoughts on the Bible. First, sorry, I got to move my thing here. The story of a God who doesn't break promises. Let's see. Yeah, looking just at the top of 53, God's story has its own twists and turns, its own chapters of rage and repentance, along with some magnificent cruelties, but is above all the story of a God who does not break promises, a God who entered into covenant with humankind and remains loyal to that bond, no matter what we may think of its terms, and no matter how we may connive to test them. That is the God who walks toward me in the Bible. Not only the God of the past, but also the God of the present and the future, whose promise of relationship has no expiration date. The Bible is the book in which the terms of that relationship are explored. Again, I don't expect that you may have all of the same insight about the Bible as Barbara Brown Taylor, but I think this is a helpful way of thinking about the Bible at first. The God who is committed to people, the God who is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and that this book reveals that God to us. It's just an interesting starting point for her in this. Second point here, the Bible teaches us how to imagine ourselves. And this is at the top of page 54. The Bible also teaches us how to imagine ourselves. In a world where we're offered so many unsolicited definitions of ourselves, it's easy to forget who we are. First, there are all the voices that come to us from outside ourselves, describing us as successes or failures based on our looks, our performances, or incomes. According to a copy of Vanity Fair magazine I read recently, the ideal human being is rich, thin, powerful, and smart. If women are not beautiful, at least they dress well, while the men tend toward a look of disheveled aristocracy. Children, oddly enough, are nowhere to be seen. The idea that, I don't think we often think of it this way, but that the world has many, many, many identities on offer for us, and that part of the function of the Bible is to remind us of who we are, right? Teaches us how to sort of put those ideas up on the shelf of, I need to be rich, thin, powerful, and smart, and say, no, God sees me as something different. And the Bible gives me a language for who I am as beloved child of God. So again, if you don't love her way of looking at the Bible completely, I like the way that it starts with understanding God and then understanding ourselves in light of that God, the God who doesn't change, and we understand ourselves better in relationship with him. Finally, next is teaching us how to imagine the world. And here she's got basically her story of, spending time in Israel. I won't read all of it, but, basically as she spends time in Israel, she imagines Jesus, about halfway down the page. We are imagining Jesus ahead of us, balanced on the back of a small donkey, entering the last week of his life along a road strewn with palms. The Bible sort of invites us into this imaginative world where we go back in a different place. And the Bible teaches us to be able to look at our own world with those kind of imaginative eyes. That the world is really a place where it's not just ordinary human life, people work until they die, but a place where God breaks in and there's this divine drama going on in the world that we're invited as preachers to retell on behalf of our people. And so there's also this piece of imagining the world differently. Reminding us, and I love this language on page 58, that God is palpable. You can see this at the top of page 58, but she talks about this novelist Reynolds Price, who did his own translation of the four gospels and called it a palpable God. A God who is close, tangible, close enough to be felt and known, not a God who is removed from real life. I have to say, and again, this I think is the key to imaginative, is one of the keys to imaginative preaching, and maybe part of what the evangelical world suffers from a little bit, is she wants to remind us that the Bible is not just like a way of encoding some disembodied truth, but that the Bible is truth. The Bible shows us truth lived out in the person of Jesus. And so it's not like we can look at a story and say, okay, what's it mean? And then like distill it down and say, okay, what it means is X, Y, Z. No, instead, there's a way that we only know the truth when we know the God who comes into human existence, and that the truth is revealed to us through that kind of interaction with God, not through a kind of like disembodied kind of connection with it. If God had wanted to reveal truth in that kind of esoteric way, he could have, but instead it was this radically incarnational way of showing us the truth. Page 59 to 60, just talking about how God is beyond us. I don't know if you've heard this, this quote from the Chronicles of Narnia at the top of page 60 about Aslan. Is he quite safe? I shall feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, dearie, and no mistake. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe, said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king, I tell you. I don't know if that's a familiar passage to you. I've certainly heard that in a few sermons in my time. But that idea of God, part of what the Bible does is reveal to us a God who really challenges all of our preconceptions. And to be honest, a lot of people's spiritual lives suffer because they rush past the parts of God that seem to challenge their existence and their understanding. I think many people, because they have a hard time letting God as if they could stop God, but letting God be counterintuitive to them. Like they have a hard time letting that happen. Like they have a hard time imagining God might require something of me that I don't feel like I should have to give, or whatever. Because they don't let that happen, then they feel like intuitively that God is very small and can't help them when they need help because they have made God that small, because they won't let God push them outside of what they find is natural and comfortable. So important for us as preachers to sit with those portions of the text that push us beyond our comfort zones. If there's something in a text, I don't know. Again, we think about maybe the story of Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, right? The woman who, like, he says when he compares her to a dog, when he says like, it's not wise to it's not my job to take the children's food and give it to dogs. And the woman says to him, well, even dogs, eat the crumbs that are from around the table. That can be a really challenging passage, for instance, right? Like, and sometimes we just like want to skate by those things or explain them as quickly as possible, instead of like sitting with the profound discomfort we have from reading a text like that. Like why Jesus uses the language he does. I guarantee you, if there's a skeptic in your congregation, or even just like a person who's honest intellectually, they want to know the answer to that question. Why did Jesus say that? Like, what was he meaning? And it's not to say you have to have the answer for it, but you will quickly be found out by your people if you try to skate by that question without really struggling with it, without really answering it. And the fact is, right, the Bible does this. It brings us into if we are willing to have that encounter, it brings us into encounter with profoundly challenging aspects of God's character that if we don't sit with it, no one's going to sit with it. And so like the Bible really, it offers us that. It's again, even if you were to look at it solely in human terms, it's a 2,000-year-old book about it from a radically different culture. And so even just in human terms, for us to sit with the way that it is radically removed from 2021 North American life and sit with those things rather than rush past them. Super, super important. So let's jump in here. I'll just put up the discussion questions I want us to think about. So talk about your relationship with the Bible first. And that might sound like a silly way to say it, but are you generally a person who loves the Bible? And here I'm just asking you to be honest. Like, do you love the Bible, or are you a person who feels like duty bound about the Bible? I will say for me, like, it was a long time before I think I really loved the Bible. I grew up hearing enough messages in my church about the importance of daily devotions, that kind of thing, where for me, for a long time, the Bible was something like a vitamin that I was supposed to take my daily devotion. I was supposed to do that every day, but I didn't really know to love it till I was much older. So I don't know, did you have a relationship like that with the Bible, or have you always loved the Bible? Tell me what your relationship with the Bible was like.
Yes, mine was kind of like, kind of like how you just mentioned, like when I was growing up, I understood, there was messages in the Bible. I had a hard time reading the messages. And but as I've gone to seminary training, I've gone to training like this, and as I've actually had people, classes now, which kind of point out certain aspects of the Bible or different ways of looking at the Bible. And I started seeing things differently. And as my relationship also grows with Christ, now I'm more intrigued. I want to know more. Now I want to know more about the history. But I guess, yeah, originally it was probably duty bound because, hey, you just listen to the message. You got what you literally got out of the message, but you just didn't know how to ask those questions. I never thought about asking some of those questions or using my imagination in different ways. My imagine things I imagine as of the day, but now that I've read the Bible, and I've read the different books several times now, and got a better understanding. Now I can actually imagine their time, what they were going through, what they were possibly wearing, how they were eating, how they were living. So now it's become more intriguing.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I think when we only have that idea of the Bible as a thing that has important lessons for us in it, that can be, I mean, some people really like that. I mean, they love the process of trying to decode what the lesson is. But I think for people who are called to pastor often, and we love people, and what you're talking about, Joseph, just being able to let the people in the Bible become real people suddenly makes the book interesting in a really different way, because at least as long as it's just a book of lessons, we might feel really tense about it, because it's like, I mean, I love the people around me. There are some lessons here that might be really challenging for them to learn. How do I help them to learn these lessons, as opposed to, there's some really interesting people in this book, and in some way these people are my people, and I want to introduce these people to the people who are here in the pews with me now, so they can get to know each other a little bit. That's entirely different relationship. So others of you, like your relationship with the Bible, has it always been something you loved? Is it something that challenges you? Yeah, Heather.
I think largely, I went to an extremely Christian grade school and high school. So I think I had a relationship with the Bible that was really just seeing it as a textbook. And I think I'm still kind of trying to break away from that, rather than just seeing it as something to study and master, and trying to have a personal relationship with the text, and playing with the text and seeing it as real people and stuff. So it's an interesting journey, and sometimes I definitely see myself slipping more into studying it like a textbook. But that's definitely just how I was introduced to it largely. Even though we did have chapels and they did encourage us to do daily devotions and everything, but it was still something to be studied and memorized and quizzed on. So yeah, I think now that I'm seeing it, I'm like, oh yeah, I really still do that, I think. So.
Oh, that's good. And again, it may feel kind of at war with the empathetic part of you, because it feels kind of like it belongs to this category of knowledge or head knowledge, as opposed to the, again, I mean, I don't know you well enough to say this, but like usually the kind of thing that draws a person to want to preach and to help, like preaching is often considered a helping profession. The kind of things that pulls a person towards a helping profession is a care and connection with people. And so when we discover the text can do that, there's a bit of healing that can happen. And again, I don't know what it looks like for all of you, but I mean, these two, the two who have shared, I mean, it points to the need to have a bit of healing often for many, a bit of healing of their relationship with the Bible so that they can preach it in a way that brings out its truth. Like we don't want to hide the truth that's here, but also does so in a way that's not at war with our empathetic side all the time. So hopefully Lenny's book will help with this, but. All right. Which of Taylor's ways of understanding the Bible feel right to you? I don't know if you remember when you read this, like, was there anything that feels wrong about the way that she approached the Bible? Anything that feels especially right or wrong from this chapter to you?
There's one thing in my copy, because my page numbers aren't the same as yours.
Oh, sorry.
It's
Okay.
it's on page 57, but she talks about the Bible helps us know the difference between imagination and delusion by tethering our own imaginations to that of the whole people of the Bible. And the Bible teaches us to imagine the God who was and is and who shall be. And I only mention that because I really enjoy the imagination part of what we talked about and how we use our imagination to bring the stories of the Bible alive. But we also need to remember that the Bible needs to keep us grounded in what it really is, instead of making it something that it's not to make us more comfortable. That kind of brings me back to the point of the Bible still has to be the Bible. It's not, I can't make the picture better than it is. You know, they were in the Jordan and the water came down on them. Well, they probably swam away because they were probably fine. No, it literally, you know what I mean? So we can take our imagination and try to imagine stuff that really didn't happen in it. But you also got to keep grounded with that, I guess. Like if you can understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, and I appreciate you bringing that up because I think for her that's, and again, I don't know exactly what section that's in, but for her, that idea of when God is revealed to be beyond us, should be the kind of thing that keeps us grounded and says like, okay, while it's good for me to imaginatively approach the text, I need to not just let my own kind of intuitions about what it must have been like then sort of take over. Yeah, and that's very easy to do for a lot of reasons, but one is the kind of modern Western impulse to imagine ourselves as the apex, right? Like, like all of history has been building to this moment when we finally have it right, as opposed to being chastened and challenged by a generational wisdom in the Bible that's maybe powerful because it's not from modern Western culture and challenges modern Western culture's sense of right and wrong. So, yeah. And you're right. I mean, I wasn't thinking about the Jordan stories exactly, but I mean, all those kind of holy war stories from Joshua are profoundly challenging, you know, to our sense of like, God did this. Like, yeah.
And to be able to accept the fact that this, you know, every story or every illustration of the Bible doesn't have a happy ending.
Yep.
You know, and people want that happy ending in their Bible stories. They want to know that everything was glorious in the end, but and not just portraying as God being this, you know, this powerful being that's totally crushes your dreams, but to understand what it's there for, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. Any thoughts on this third question? When have you seen the Bible misused or used well in preaching? Like when you think about the ways that you're accustomed to hearing the Bible used or talked about, are there times where you see this is, you know, having read this chapter, are there times where you're like, oh, boy, when I look back at that sermon I heard or that way I heard preaching growing up, I don't think that was good. Or are there ways that you're thinking like, yeah, that was really a good, healthy way of looking at the Bible, using the Bible in preaching? Any thoughts on that? I might be putting you on the spot for 8:42 on a Wednesday evening, but
I think we would all say sometimes verses taken out of context and you just hear that verse thrown out so many times. And then when you actually get to sit down and read the whole context, like either the whole, chapter or the whole book, like it just changes it completely. And so I think that's one of the ways that it can be misused sometimes.
Yeah, that's a great example. And often with the best of intention, right? Like, because, and perhaps there is something that could serve that person's point, but when we use the Bible that way, it's not a good thing. So proof texting is very dangerous. So yeah, any other ways of kind of misusing the Bible, or when you've seen it used really well? The one other thing that Lenny and I sort of talked about, which I would just put in this category, might be, when a person, Lenny and I were just talking about like when we can listen, when we can approach our audience, our listeners, as if we really believe they want to do the right thing. Like sort of assuming that our listeners want to be partners in bringing in the kingdom of God, not that they're enemies that need to be overwhelmed. And I think sometimes there is a kind of anger that people hide behind the Bible with. Part of, and I'm sure Lenny has been accused of this. This is what I was kind of asking him about. Sometimes when we come across too empathetically, there's a way that people look at that and say, that's not biblical. Like what needs to happen right now is the truth needs to be told. And the only way that such people recognize the truth being told is when it's told with a particularly angry bent, if that makes sense. And so I think there's a way of using the Bible sometimes to kind of justify our own anger, to justify our own frustration with the current situation. And that is really dangerous too, to think that the Bible, I've heard many people justify their own anger by saying, well, Jesus was angry. He overturned the tables, forgetting that Jesus was really an exceptional figure in human history who was probably capable of managing his anger far better than any of us. So I do think sometimes there's a way of talking about the Bible that simply masks human anger. Well, last question. What's most intimidating about looking at the Bible for preaching? Like, is there a particular part of the Bible that you're nervous about? The thought of, oh, I might have to preach about that someday, or so like a part of the Bible or something we've talked about the Bible that's particularly intimidating when you think about it. I think I mentioned last week, for instance, I'm still intimidated by preaching the Old Testament, particularly in front of our Old Testament scholar, right? Because I realize how far the Old Testament is removed from, like, if the New Testament is this far removed from modern Western culture, the Old Testament is much farther removed. And not only that, but there's a lot of Christian understanding of the Old Testament that might not be real accurate either. Stories we've told ourselves about the Old Testament, like, well, the Old Testament's all about law, but the New Testament's about grace. And that's not really true. Like there's lots and lots of grace in the Old Testament, but we have to kind of unlearn popular conceptions of the Old Testament in order to preach it faithfully, which makes it really scary to preach. So those are the kind of things that intimidate me still, is the more removed the text is from our modern world, the harder it is to preach. So it still can be intimidating 22 years into preaching. So I don't know, anything else that's intimidating to you when you think about approaching the Bible for preaching?
I think anything related to end times, like the whole book of Revelation, or anything about prophecies as well, especially because I've heard them preached in the different churches that I've been to, preached completely different ways. And so I haven't studied enough to kind of come to terms with what I believe may be true. And so I would be very intimidated by touching any of those themes.
Thanks for saying that. And again, that's the kind of thing that takes us back to Brian's point before. I mean, to realize that these things are really beyond us, and that as we approach them, we should do it pretty delicately because it's way out of our most of our sphere of knowledge, and it's mysterious even for the experts to think about what the book of Revelation is talking about. And again, we do better with those texts when we sort of are aware going in of, wow, there's some ambiguity here, and I need to be careful and cautious and not just assume that my initial intuitions are what's right. You know, that helps us become more faithful with those things that intimidate.
Probably one of the things that intimidates me a little bit is looking at the Bible, you know, and then thinking, especially because I said all that, what I've learned, especially over the past, you know, 7 or 8 years that I've been growing closer to my relationship, I've learned to look at things with a different perspectives and actually open my mind up more. But now, because I've learned to do that, and I've learned how deep you can actually go as you're looking for all this and trying to get a better understanding, I'm like, well, first, am I really giving them the accurate representation of the Bible when I am preaching? And plus, there's just so much here. How do I cut this down to 20 to 28 minutes? Because there's just so much, you know, you need to know about this background to really understand the small message that we're trying to deliver.
Mm-hmm. You know, Joseph, I really appreciate you mentioning all of that, because I think it's not healthy when a preacher loses their reverence for that. You know, like to realize, wow, that the calling, I mean, even as we're talking about the act of preaching being as sharing God's word with people, I mean, that's a tremendous thing to take on ourselves, to believe that God has given us. And you know, the paradox is, of course, we do it better when we have the humility enough to recognize that we can't do it with our own strength. And that's so it's a healthy place to be. But you're right, it kind of keeps us in this place where we're like, I always need to keep learning. I always need to keep growing because I want to do this better and better. And you know, I don't know how you will look at it many years into your for me, when I think back about, you know, the sermons I preached, whatever, 20, 21 years ago, sometimes I'm like afraid, but then I realize like there's never a perfect sermon. You know what I mean? Like there's never a sermon that God looks at and he says, that's it. That's the apogee of preaching. There can be no better sermon, you know? And so God is very used to taking imperfect words and doing his work with them. And we have to trust that, you know, words that are offered faithfully, like from a faithful heart, can still have the power to change hearts for good, even when there's error mixed in, because they're human. But you know, we get closer to that happening as long as we're not breezy about like, oh, I know everything. But it's scary to acknowledge. So yeah. Everyone, I appreciate all your attention tonight. This has been a great discussion, and we'll talk next week. Again, Meredith Griffin's going to join us. I emailed him tonight to get the sermon that we are supposed to watch of his. So we will have a sermon of his to watch. So I'll let you know that link sometime during the week when I've heard back from him. But I expect tomorrow or next day probably to have that. So otherwise, I guess I'll see you next week. If you have any questions, holler, okay? Great to see you. Have a good night.